Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final match in the quarterfinals round of the International Reparations Debate Competition for 2026. We have had a day and a half, excellent matches, amazing debates. And of course, it has been sad that we've so far sent home three teams, but ultimately advancing three. It's been really, really challenging, but exciting. My name is Jermaine Barrett, and I'll be the chair adjudicator for this match. And I will now invite my panelists to introduce themselves, beginning with Kalisa Vassal.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just as excited as Jermaine for this last match in the quarterfinals. If the other matches have said anything about the matchup that we're about to experience right now, it's that we're in for a show. All the best to both teams. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalisa. And we're also joined on the panel by Javon Doney. Javon, please introduce yourself. Javon Doney? All right, and not.
Oh my God,
Oh,
I've been
go
speaking, but I was muted.
It
Yes.
happens. Don't worry, it happens.
Yeah. So good night, everyone. I'm Javon Doney, as Jermaine just said, and I am excited just the same for what I hope is an exciting and riveting match to conclude the quarterfinals. Best of luck to both teams and wows.
Indeed, indeed. I'm sure they will, Javon. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to be introduced to the debaters. We have two teams, both of whom come from Jamaica. We have on the proposition side, that side government, the Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy, and they're going up against their fellow compatriots from Clarendon College. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now invite, uh, before we actually invite them to introduce themselves, though, a critical bit of information. The sponsors and partners of this competition, we need to disclose them to you, so we'll do that now. Alicia, who are our sponsors and partners?
This competition is brought to you by the University of the West Indies, the UWI Press, the Center for Reparation Research, JADE Limited, the University of Hull, and our main sponsor, the Repair Campaign.
Thank you very much, Kalicia. All right, so you heard the two teams from the Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy on proposition, Clarendon College on side opposition, both teams hailing from Jamaica. Let us now be introduced to the debaters, beginning with those from the Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy. Go right ahead, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Noika Archer, and I am the Prime Minister.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Akila Wilson, and I am the Deputy Prime Minister.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Cyan Brazil, and I am the Whip Speaker.
All right, thank you very much, Alpha. And now over to Clarendon College. Go right ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shanika Grant, and I am the first speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Alia Mackenzie, and I am the second speaker.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Marlene Green, and I am the third speaker.
All right, thank you very much, Clarendon College. And fun fact, audience, Clarendon College placed second in the competition last year. Of course, that indicates that they're a strong, strong team. All right, so we now move to disclosing the rules. The rules are as follows. Each team has having three debaters. The first debater will speak for 7 minutes. The second debater speaks for 6 minutes. The third and final debater will speak for 5 minutes. Of course, after the first two speakers, we will have a period of cross-examination. We'll have another such period after the second pair of debaters make their presentation. I'll explain to you a little later at the appropriate time the rules for the cross-examination. But after the second period of cross-examination, we will pause for 1 minute and then we will resume with the reply speaker from team opposition first. Then the debate will conclude with the third speaker's presentation from team proposition. Debaters, please be mindful of the rules with respect to timings. You have 2 periods of protected times, first and last minutes of your speech. Those will be indicated in the chat by Calicia. And of course, you will be told via the chat when you have spoken for the allotted time. But we're kind, so we give you 15 seconds extra. And within at that juncture, you must stop. All right. That applies to the first and second speakers only. No points of information are allowed during the third speaker's presentation. All right, so let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, I now call upon the Honorable Prime Minister from the Convent of Mercy Alva Academy to open this debate. Hear.
Esteemed judges and adjudicators, in this debate, migration refers to the voluntary movement of Caribbean citizens across borders for long-term settlement, primarily for purposes such as employment, education, or economic advancement. Importantly, within this motion, it is state-influenced but not forced. It involves structured pathways shaped by government policy, for example, visas, job pipelines, and incentives. It is not short-term travel. It implies relocation with the intention to live, work, and integrate. Would rather, in this motion, signals a comparative policy preference, not an absolute restriction. It means that the government will prioritize, incentivize, and facilitate migration to Africa over former colonial powers. It does not ban or prohibit migration to Europe. Instead, it actively makes Africa the more accessible, beneficial, and attractive option. Former colonial powers refers to countries such as England, France, and the Netherlands. Caribbean governments, primarily through regional coordination via CARICOM, will actively prioritize and facilitate migration to Africa states over former colonial powers. This model operates under 4 mechanisms. First, legal and migration infrastructure, which removes access barriers. CARICOM states will enter binding bilateral agreements with African countries such as Ghana and Nigeria to establish fast-track visa system, processing within weeks, not months or years, dual citizenship or right of abode pathways for Caribbean nationals, and mutual recognition of qualifications, examples, nurses, teachers, and engineers. Secondly, guaranteed economic assimilation. Governments will create direct employment pipelines, including placement of Caribbean professionals into African labor systems, joint public-private programs with Caribbean workers with hospitals, schools, startups, and tech hubs. Additionally, minimum 1 to 2 year contracts guaranteed upon migration through states partnerships. Thirdly, financial incentive and risk reduction. To ensure uptake, governments will provide relocation grants covering flights, initial housing, and resettlement costs. Tax breaks for diaspora entrepreneurs invested in African markets, access to low-interest business loans for Caribbean migrants in Africa, and insurance and relocation protection schemes to reduce financial risk. We don't restrict choice, we make Africa the rational choice. Fourth and last, institutional and cultural integration. This solves they won't belong. Governments will partner with African institutions to create university exchange and scholarship programs, diaspora integration offices, building on existing structures in Ghana and Nigeria, and expansion of policies like Ghana's Year of Return and right of abode laws for diaspora populations. These ensure migrants are not just workers, but long-term participants in society. That is our policy. The first reason we affirm this motion is because migration to Europe is not simply an economic decision. It is a part of a historical process that actively produces underdevelopment. Mr. Speaker, migration to Europe doesn't just move people, it moves development out of our regions and into already dominant economies, continuing a system that has existed since colonialism. In How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney argues that underdevelopment is not the absence of development, but the result of an unequal relationship where Europe's growth was built through the extraction of labor and resources from regions like Africa and the Caribbean. This framework remains directly relevant today. Instead of extracting enslaved labor, Europe now extracts human capital. Caribbean countries such as Jamaica continue to lose a significant portion of their skilled workforce, as documented by the World Bank. These individuals migrate primarily to the United Kingdom and France, where they fill labor shortages in critical sectors. This is not coincidence, it is continuity. The Caribbean bears the cost of training professionals while Europe benefits from their labor. Remittances do not solve this imbalance. They do not rebuild institutions or restore lost capacity. They simply exist within a system that continues to extract value outwards. When the Caribbean citizens migrate to Europe, they enter economies that benefits from their skills without paying the cost of training them. Europe fills labor shortages and strengthens its institutions, while we lose the very people needed to build our own. This is not just brain drain, it is institutional weakening. Hospitals lose nurses and schools lose teachers. So migration to Europe is not just an individual gain, it is a collective loss. So we must ask, if migration continues to transfer value from Caribbean to Europe, how can it ever produce development? It cannot. Migration to Africa interrupts this process. Under our model, Caribbean migrants enters economies such as Ghana and Nigeria as participants in growth, not source of extraction. We already see this through the diaspora-led investment in Ghana following the year of return and through the diaspora involvement in Nigeria fintech sector. This creates a shift from development through extraction to development through collaboration. Mr. Speaker, the second reason we affirm this motion is because Europe does not offer genuine belonging. It offers conditional inclusion within systems shaped by racial hierarchy. In France, the ideology of Republican universalism creates inequality by ignoring race. Yet this refusal to acknowledge race prevents meaningful engagement with inequality. Caribbean migrants are expected to assimilate fully into French identity, yet remaining socially and economically marginalized. This experience of Amy Cesar reveals this contradiction. As a student in Paris, he encountered a system that demanded the suppression of his Black and Caribbean identity. His response to the negritude was not simply cultural, it was a rejection of a system that required self-erasure as the price of belonging. Let us focus our attention to the Windrush scandal. Caribbean migrants who were invited to rebuild Britain after World War II, who worked, paid taxes, and lived there for decades, were later denied legal status, detained, and even deported. That shows us something very critical. No matter how much you integrate, belonging is never guaranteed. So we must ask, if Caribbean citizens must migrate, if Caribbean migrants must assimilate yet are never fully accepted, what kind of belonging is that? Across the continent, including South Africa, societies have confronted and dismantled systems of racial domination. The end of apartheid was not simply a political transition, it was demonstrated that systems of racial hierarchy can be recognized, resisted, and transformed. This matters because it reflected a fundamental different approach to race. While Europe often denies or minimizes racial inequality, African societies shaped by colonialism and racial struggle, have directly engaged with it. So I must pose to this House this question: is it really worth migrating to a country if belonging there requires you to lose who you are? In countries like Ghana, diaspora policies such as the Right of Abode laws and initiative following the year of return actively facilitate integration. These policies are grounded in the recognition that members of the diaspora are not outsiders, but are a part of a shared historical continuum. So the distinction is clear. In Europe, migrants must assimilate in systems that deny their experiences, and in Africa, belonging is rooted in shared history, acknowledged struggle, and institutional inclusion. So the choice is simple. Do we continue a cycle of extraction, or do we begin one of shared development and real inclusion? I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for opening this debate. We now call upon the leader of the opposition to open opposition's case. Hear, hear.
Just your laptop lock.
In Montego Bay High School, we're waiting for the leader of the opposition to begin.
Our proposition limits the motion to Guyana and Nigeria, but Africa is a continent that has far many different countries which are in the stages of development. are developing. They also move to say that development outside of our region will benefit, Europe will build from extraction labor, but we migrated to Europe will help us to benefit from the past structures which are created from colonialism, and these systems are still integral today. We will greatly benefit from these systems. Lastly, the proposition mentions about guaranteed economic assimilation, but this is faulty because people migrate for better benefits of living, and the African currency is inadequate to that of the Jamaican currency. To begin, people are influenced to migrate due to push and pull factors. These factors are weighed, and in the end, it determines their decision. Therefore, individuals should have the right to make their own choices when it comes to where they want to go, rather than it be decided for them. This debate is about maximizing opportunities for citizens, not correcting history to restricting their choices. Mr. Speaker, Africa is classified as a developing continent, and so all of its countries are categorized as developing, while countries in Europe are mostly developed. Now, with all that being said, we firmly reject this motion that this House would rather its citizens to migrate to Africa than a former colonial power. In this debate, I will present two arguments. One, migration can serve as a form of historical responsibility because former colonies would be able to benefit from the former colonial powers. Two, migrating to a former colonial power would make migrants benefit from factors such as better education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and higher wages. Our second speaker will discuss how former colonial powers are better able to accommodate migration than Africa, and my second speaker would also be building on my point about how migrating to former colonial powers is better for remittances. And our third speaker will summarize our stance and prove why we have won this debate. My first claim is migration can serve as a form of historical responsibility because former colonies would be able to benefit from the former colonial powers. My warrant is, according to national museums, Liverpool and the slave trade, Liverpool became the largest slave trading port in Britain during the 18th century as it peaked. It accounted around 40 to 80% of Britain's transatlantic slave voyages, transporting hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The wealth generated from slavery helped building the city's infrastructure, including banks, docks, and commercial institutions that still supports its economy today. The impact is that if our citizens migrate to former colonial powers like the United Kingdom, it becomes far more than just an economic movement. It will facilitate a form of historical accountability and redistribution of opportunity. As a result, this allows descendants of colonial populations to access better wages, education, and healthcare systems that were partially built on the exploitation of their ancestors. Moreover, migration aligns a moral obligation on former colonial powers to accept migrants. This will further strengthen arguments for more open immigration policies and social inclusion. My second claim is migrating to a former colonial power would make migrants benefit from factors such as better education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and higher wages. My warrant is that with the inclusion of these factors, migrants will be able to benefit from a better standard of living, and they can also cater for their families outside of the country. As it relates to education, there is an aspect of cultural familiarity in the educational system among former colonizers and former colonies. Take into consideration the subject law. For an example, if I was to migrate to the United Kingdom to pursue this subject, the impact of this is that I would be able to easily assimilate into the environment because there's a correlation with the content that is being taught here and in the United Kingdom. According to an article entitled A Comparative Health Disparities Analysis Across Continents, a comparative analysis of African and European countries, the mean for acute lower respiratory infection, ALR, in Africa is 2,361.1 with a standard deviation of 6,894.4, while in Europe, the mean value is much lower as 10.8 with a standard deviation of 10.8. UN et al. 2020. The impact of this is that Africa's healthcare system is in need of great, robust public health emergency response systems in order for them to properly regulate and treat these health issues. Mr. Speaker, under these conditions, when something that is as vital as healthcare is inadequate and unstable to mention, countries like Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone are plagued by ongoing yellow fever risk, and countries like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt are being affected by air pollution due to household and industrial causes. With all of these being said, Mr. Speaker, why would we want to put our citizens into harm's way? And when prevention is way better than cure, when we can be safer and aiding significantly in a former colonial power? As Europe struggles with critical labor shortages as a result of its aged population, shrinking working age populations, and low fertility rates, this influencing the growth in work permits. In 2024, African citizens received 600,000 first resident permits in EU, roughly double the number from a decade earlier, indicating a rise in legal labor pathways. Mr. Speaker, the impact of this is that Africans themselves have been migrating to Europe in recent years due to many factors such as warfare, unemployment, potential for underemployment, which is a result of being overqualified for available roles and lower wages in formal sectors compared to Europe. According to World Bank World Development Indicators, International Labour Organization, ILO, Global Wage Report, the overall wage levels in European countries such as Germany, France, and United Kingdom generally offer significantly higher wages than most African countries. Average monthly salaries in Europe often range between 2,000 and 4,000 euro, depending on the country and profession. In contrast, in countries like Nigeria or Kenya, average monthly earnings are much lower, often between 100 and 800 in many sectors, although higher skilled jobs pay more. Mr. Speaker, the impact is these salaries are too insufficient to be sent back home as remittances to our families. When people migrate to provide for themselves and families a better standard of living. Overall, these factors prove that Africa has fewer opportunities and so Europe has far more stability and infrastructure. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we care about our citizens' mobility, welfare, and standard of living. The opposition rests for now.
Thank you very much, Leader of the Opposition. We now move to the first segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the opposition, Team Clarendon College, will get the first opportunity to ask questions of the proposition team, Team Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy. They will ask 3 questions. Convent will each of those questions will be limited to 10 seconds, and each response from the opposing team limited to 45 seconds. Afterwards, we'll flip and allow Alpha to ask their questions of Clarendon College. Allow me to apologize. I made a mistake earlier on. I addressed the opposition team as Montego Bay High, but rather they are Clarendon College. My apologies. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let's get this segment started. I now invite the opposition team, Team Clarendon College, to pose their questions to the proposition team, Team Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy.
Okay, you made the point about belonging would come naturally in Africa, but wouldn't strong tribalism contest with the idea of guaranteed integration and belonging?
Can you repeat that question for us, please?
You mentioned belonging in Africa as one of your points for migrating to Africa. However, wouldn't strong tribalism and contest the idea of guaranteed integration and belonging?
Strong tribalization would not hinder that sense of belonging in particular African states. Because as we had mentioned a few countries in whom are being developed and are being built up. Furthermore, even if there is strong tribalization in some African states, it is through this migration and through experiences with them. As we had mentioned in our policy, there was going to be some university exchanges. We would be able to familiarize ourselves with them and give them an opportunity to familiarize themselves with us. So just because they have strong tribalistic tendencies should not deter us from seeking to migrate to Africa, rather should serve as a reason for us to, so that we may be able to familiarize ourselves with them and for them to get to know us. Thank you.
Okay, so with that response, considering the state of many African states with access to resources, just how many of these African states students will be able to access all these university exchange programs?
You had asked us how many of these states would be able to access these university programs. Again, in our model, we had said that we would have strong binding bilateral agreements with African states. That means that they would like to work with us. That number, I would say, is not necessarily definite. It could be any number. I mean, Africa has 52 or 56 states. It could be 52, it could be 56, it could be 40 something, it could be 20 something. The point is that a link exists and it gives us something to start with. So depending on the states that would want to work with us through those bilateral agreements, that would determine the number of universities. Furthermore, it's important to know that there are many universities inside of every state in Africa. So it really depends. That's rather an ambiguous question.
If migration to Africa results in lower income, less stability, and fewer opportunities, how can you claim it is the better option?
Migration to Africa, you said that it offers less stability and fewer opportunities. That is completely false. Migration to Africa actually does offer a lot of stability and job opportunities in the sense that they are a developing country. That means that they need people to help them better their society and economy. In countries such as in the UK, for example, or France, they have already developed economies. They're strong, they're rigid, it is set in stone. But actually, because of Africa having a developing state of being, they'd be more accepting of us to go and work with them. We are working with them through our bilateral agreements, and they will help to work with us. So they would accept us way more than going over to Europe. Then they would accept us. They would take us in there. We would have a better sense of belonging with us. Furthermore, in our model, we had also stated that we would provide grants, housing, a percentage reduction in tax. There are so much things that we're offering them when migrating to Europe that you will not find when migrating to Africa than when migrating to Europe.
All right, thank you very much for that phase of question and answers. We move on now. This time I call upon the proposition team, Team Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy, to pose their questions to the opposition team, Team Clarendon College.
You argue that remittances benefit the Caribbean, but can remittances replace the loss of skilled professionals in hospitals and schools, or do they simply compensate for a problem migration itself creates?
Okay, so first of all, migrating to Africa will not fix this issue of brain drain. People will still be leaving our country. Second of all, when remittances are sent back to our country, people can actually send their children to school, and these children can actually get an education in school, go off to universities, and then contribute positively to our economy with the remittance money that their parents send for tuition.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up question. If through remittances, that will help to better our children and whatnot, what happens when you have enough money to send your child to school, but there is no teacher there because the teacher has migrated to Europe?
Again, migrating to Africa will not solve the issue, because if the person or the teacher migrates to Africa, or if they migrate to Europe, they're still not going to be in Jamaica to actually teach in the classroom. So what you're proposing does not make any sense or contribute to the development of our country as a whole.
Okay. So if Caribbean migrants must assimilate to Europe, how do you explain cases like the Winner scandal, where even long-term residents were deported? What exactly does assimilation guarantee?
Okay, so first of all, with colonial states, we already know their language. We already can integrate more educationally. And this is definitely not guaranteed on the part of Africa. For example, the Rohingya ethnic group in the Myanmar, country in Africa, they were ostracized. They were denied of status despite being Africans, despite being people from the continent itself. And despite residing in the country, they don't have formal status. So integration is not guaranteed in Africa, as you're saying. But the thing is, integration is not guaranteed in Africa. Economic benefits are not guaranteed in Africa. However, we at least have some form of legal framework to guarantee that economic opportunities will not be significantly restricted because of racism, for one, and two, the currency is stronger. So even if we experience some kind of, let's say, sense of not belonging, at least we will be able to put food on the tables for our families in Jamaica.
I'm sorry, I apologize. So we've just exited the first segment of cross-examination. We will now invite the Deputy Speaker from the opposition side, that's the Deputy Prime Minister, to advance the proposition's case. Hear.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition would have us believe that Caribbean migration should naturally flow to Europe, the former colonial powers. They present it as the safe, stable, and obvious choice. What they call opportunity is frequently a chair at a table you did not build under the rules you did not write. Caribbean migrants do not need permission to lead, innovate, or shape societies. They deserve real agency, real influence, and real autonomy. The opposition will argue from practicality, claiming Europe provides stability, strong institutions, and predictable opportunities, while Africa is uncertain and risky. Though intuitive, this view misunderstands both what stability truly means and the long-term cost of dependence. We must begin by asking, stable for whom and at what cost? Europe's stability is not neutral, it is historically constructed. The economic and institutional strength of countries like the United Kingdom and France was built through centuries of extraction from regions like the Caribbean and Africa. To continue directing Caribbean migration towards these states is to continue reinforcing the very system that produced inequality in the first place. We can see this structurally in examples like CFA franc, where economic systems in parts of Africa remain tied to former colonial powers decades after independence. These systems limit control, restrict policy flexibility, and reinforce external dependence. Mr. Speaker, in Europe, inclusion often comes without influence. Migrants can participate, they can work, contribute, and pay taxes, but their ability to lead and shape systems is limited. The reason we affirm this motion is because Africa offers not just opportunity, but the conditions for upward mobility and influence. Countries such as Nigeria and Ghana are experiencing growth in sectors such as technology, finance, and creative industries. Lagos has become a major fintech hub, while Accra has seen expansion in entrepreneurship and tourism driven in part by diaspora engagement. What distinguishes Africa from Europe is not just economic growth, it is access to influence within that growth. In Europe, Caribbean migrants enter mature economies with rigid hierarchies and limited mobility. In Africa, particularly under our model, they enter expanding markets where they can build businesses, invest in emerging sectors, and shape development. This is the European model. You can join the system, but you do not control it. Africa offers something fundamentally different, access to leadership and system building. So we must ask, where does a Caribbean migrant have more agency to adapt within a fixed system or to influence one that is still evolving? In Europe, they adapt. In Africa, they build and lead. Mr. Speaker, the final reason we affirm this motion is because migration to Africa is not simply an alternative. It is the only pathway that meaningfully disrupts the structures of dependency that continue to define the Caribbean's relationship with former colonial powers. Migration to Europe often continues a long-standing pattern. Talent flows outwards, dependency remains inwards. Caribbean and African professionals strengthen European economies while their own regions lose capacity. That is not progress, it is a modern continuation of human extraction. Migration to Europe feeds into this pattern by removing skilled labor from regions that need it for internal growth. This is where the opposition arguments collapses. They're asking Caribbean people to seek individual security within a system that collectively keep their region dependent. Even if some individuals succeed, the structure remains unchanged. The Caribbean continues to lose talent, remains economically tied to Europe, and is unable to develop independent capacity. So we must ask a deeper question. If migration consistently strengthens former colonial powers while weakening the Caribbean, can it ever lead to true independence? The answer is no. Now consider Africa. The opposition may characterize Africa as unstable, but this ignores both historical context and contemporary reality. African states, like Caribbean states, are products of colonial disruption. Yet, they have demonstrated a clear capacity for transformation. The example of South Africa is particularly important. The end of apartheid was not merely a political transition, it was a systematic dismantling of one of the most entrenched racial hierarchies in modern history. It demonstrated that African societies are not static or incapable of change, but are able to confront and transform deeply rooted systems of inequality. This matters because it directly changes the opposition's framing of Africa as inherently unstable. Instability is not a permanent condition, it is a stage within a process of restructuring. Europe itself went through centuries of conflict before achieving its current stability. To deny Africa the same trajectory is to ignore both history and possibility. More importantly, migration to Africa is supported through bilateral agreements, job pipelines, and diaspora integration policies. It builds on existing frameworks such as the Ghana Diaspora Engagement Strategies and Right of Abode laws, which actively facilitate long-term settlement and economic participation. From the moment of independence, leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah emphasized that political independence without economic and structural autonomy was incomplete. His vision of Pan-African unity was not symbolic, it was strategic. It recognized that formerly colonized regions could not achieve true independence while remaining economically and culturally tied to their former colonizers. That insights remain directly relevant today. Mr. Speaker, Europe offers participation, Africa offers power. Europe offers wages, Africa offers influence. Europe maintains dependency, Africa builds autonomy. This debate is not about rejecting opportunity, it is about choosing the kind of opportunity that provides control, leadership, and long-term impact. Caribbean migrants should not be positioned as contributors to systems built by former colonial powers. And for these reasons, this House must firmly prefer migration to Africa over former colonial powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was the Deputy Prime Minister from the Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy. We thank you, and we now invite the proposition. We invite the opposition second speaker to advance the opposition's case. Here.
Protocols observed permit me to highlight the flaws in the proposition stance. The proposition argues for belonging in Africa. However, they fail to acknowledge that enslaved Africans were taken from diverse regions and tribes, and one, many descendants are not aware of the tribal ancestry, and two, each state is now grappling with individual challenges far so much more severe and concerning than cultural acceptance. They mention bilateral agreements to actually cope with all their policy. However, political instability is rampant in many African states, which will make bilateral agreements quite difficult, challenging and more expensive. They also did not mention how their policy will definitely be funded, because as far as I am concerned, taxpayers' money can be used to develop the country's infrastructure more rather than funding this program. I continue. They mention the issue of migrants not being able to lead in the European countries. However, the primary reason they migrate is to put food on the table for their families, not lead another country. Furthermore, with the educational advancements they make in that country, they can return home to Jamaica or to any other Caribbean region and contribute to greater policy development later in the future. I present my first argument. Former colonial powers are better able to accommodate migration than Africa. My first warrant, there's political instability in a large number of African states. According to the World Bank's Political Stability Index, nearly 90% of African states score below the global stability midpoint, many scoring below zero. This instability is not caused by occurrences likely to exist in democratic states or a past colonial power, but by a weak rule of law, civil conflict, political violence, unconstitutional power shifts, coups, among other factors. In Sudan, for example, an ongoing civil war claimed the lives of over 200,000 individuals and caused massive infrastructural damage. Mr. Speaker, the opposition does not contend that all states are like Sudan, but the varying degrees of institutional collapse, civil conflict, and violence and other factors are still not ideal for individuals seeking to improve their economic and social standards of living. They are not even ideal for the safety of our citizens. Such instability threatens migrant safety, leaves them vulnerable to sudden policy that disrupt employment and long-term economic planning and limit access to essential public services such as healthcare. It also deters business investment and development, reducing job availability for migrants who primarily move for economic opportunity. This contrasts the more predictable political climate of former colonial powers, which offer better institutions and legal framework and stability, all factors to consider for long-term migration. This leads to my second warrant. Even the minority of African states that you mentioned that are relatively stable are under humanitarian strain from surrounding conflict and migrants. Many Africans to escape the turmoil in their regions move to other regions in the continent. Nigeria houses more refugees than the continent of Europe as a whole, and is under significant humanitarian strain, manifesting as inadequate public services, food insecurity, overcrowding of shelters. Ghana, another one of the relatively few stable countries according to the WFP World Food Program report in 2024, is experiencing increasing internal cross-border migration and is facing infrastructure and service strain due to population movements. The report details strain on food systems, social services, and governance capacity. This issue is further exacerbated by the frequency of floods and drought in the region. Mr. Speaker, encouraging migration to an already overstretched system is simply illogical. This would mean Caribbean citizens not only have to grapple with economic uncertainty, but poor social services and competition for resources and jobs with internal migrants and refugees, brewing conflict between them. On the other hand, former colonial states are not simultaneously managing refugee intakes, climate crisis, and institutional strain, making it ideal for long-term migration, economic and educational reasons. Mr. Speaker, prop advocates for Caribbean nationals to pursue uncertain cultural prospects, uncertain sense of belonging, uncertain stability of over 50 African states, poor social services, limited economic opportunities, competition for strained resources, while we encourage stability, strong institutions, and the progress and safety of citizens, the priority of every effective government. I move to my second argument. Migrating to colonial powers is better for the Caribbean economy, not accepted. The currencies are stronger than that of African states, and most Caribbean nationals send money, that is remittance, back to the Caribbean to support their families and build foundations to return. Remittances contributed to 19.10% of Jamaica's GDP. Many individuals rely on this money to economically participate in Caribbean countries and sustain themselves. If the exchange rates were to be significantly reduced due to weaker currencies and lower wages, individuals would fail to live satisfactory lives because a dollar in an African currency is not of the same great value as European currency units. This means that less money is then converted to Jamaican dollars. This leads them to participate less in the economy. And when there's limited participation in the buying of goods and services, there is less money to pull taxes from, and less taxes from these areas will either lead to an inadequate development of public sector services or increase in taxes or other areas which increases the cost of living in Caribbean nation. Increases in cost of living will mean people will then move out of the Caribbean to seek employment with higher wages, causing further migration and brain drain. Furthermore, they mentioned the point of Europe accepting our migrants will continue the cycle of, say, what was happening in colonization. However, they built their societies on the backs of Caribbean slavery. We should benefit from Liverpool. We should benefit from the opportunities that are offered in Liverpool, Bristol, France, other areas in post-colonial states, because our ancestors contributed to its development. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. We now make way for the second segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the proposition team will get a chance first to ask questions of the opposition, and then we will switch, allowing the opposition to ask their 3 questions of the proposition. All right, so let us get started. Team proposition, the Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy, you may now proceed with your 3 questions posed to Clarendon College.
In Europe, Caribbean migrants typically fill labor shortages, but in places like Nigeria fintech sector or Ghana's diaspora investment space, migrants are building businesses. Why is filling labor preferable to being an owner?
Yeah, this is simply because not everybody can be an owner, and then actually having a more stable employment or a guaranteed space in that employment space is better for their families, better for them as it relates to progressing it forward economically.
Also, people migrate for a better life. They do not migrate to lead. They migrate in order to put food in their families' back home's mouth, and not to so-called lead a country.
Okay. If migration patterns determine where talent and power flow, and the Caribbean migration continues to strengthen former colonial powers, how does your model ever lead to true Caribbean independence rather than continued dependency?
Okay, so first off, this will it won't lead to continued dependency, because the money is most of the time sent straight back into the Caribbean economy. This money is sent back to the students of the parents that migrated. This money is sent back to the families so they can participate in the economy, so they can go to school and then go to universities and then get good jobs in the country. Additionally, if it is a case that you're talking about dependency, what we need to address is the multilateral institutions that are run by mostly these post-colonial states or powerful people like the IMF or World Bank, who hold significant shares in these things. So if we are talking about dependency, we need to stop depending on that. Migration will not solve the issue of dependency. Furthermore, migrating to Africa will definitely not benefit our country's economy the same way that migrating to post-colonial states would.
The motion says, rather, if your side believes migration to Europe is better, what specific policies would you implement to prioritize Europe, and how would you justify strengthening former colonial powers over alternative partnerships like Africa?
Okay, so for specific policies, it goes both ways. They can partner with the European nations, partner with their universities to actually get our students to then get scholarships from these universities. Furthermore, we can see the advantages that not just European, post-colonial universities offer. Someone with a postgraduate Oxford degree, Cambridge degree significantly faces like a higher advantage when it comes on to looking for jobs in higher places because of the prestige of the institution. And that is the prestige that we want our Caribbean nationals to benefit from, so that they can develop and then develop our country.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that phase of cross-examination. We now call upon the opposition team, Team Clarendon College, to pose their questions to the proposition team, Team Alpha Academy.
How does your policy translate into real measurable benefits for migrants' countries?
Can you repeat that one more time, please?
Does your policy translate into real measurable benefits for migrants' countries?
To answer that question, as we had stated in our model, again, we are having bilateral agreements. Therefore, how the countries where the migration people will come from is also going to be benefited to them. For example, through our bilateral agreements, we could have university exchanges, we could have job exchanges, we are having cultural exchanges. It is not just Caribbean countries going to Africa, and Jamaica itself is left stranded. For example, let's say Jamaica. No, African states in whom we have these agreements will also be sending their personnel over to Jamaica to help build us, build our country, have job exchanges, have cultural exchanges.
It provides one such connection that Europe does not.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so what makes this policy so mutually exclusive that these bilateral agreements cannot be applied to European or post-colonial countries?
Can you repeat your question?
What makes this policy and bilateral agreements so mutually exclusive to your side that they cannot be applied to former colonial countries?
Is okay
Or-
for you.
Okay. Our policy is the better policy because in order to get to Europe or any European state, you need a visa, and that might take a lot of days, a lot of months, a lot of weeks, and we supply a fast track visa system that is processed within weeks. That is one state of our policy that is more beneficial.
Also, it is your assumption that it is just exclusive to Caribbean states and Africa. This is a solution that we proposed in our model in order to guarantee strong, legally binding exchanges with us and African states. It is your assumption for this to be exclusive between us and Africa. That is what we have stated to support this side of the motion.
And additionally, first things, when you go to Europe, you have to assimilate to their belief, their identity. You
All
can't
right,
have
thank you very much. Your 45 seconds has elapsed. Was that the third question from Alpha? Sorry, Clarendon College?
Considering the political instability of most African states that are vulnerable to coups and unconstitutional changes, how do we guarantee this visa, the stability of visas as you would propose in your model?
We can guarantee the stability of visas through an already existing structure. So for example, Ghana's year of return. That's an already existing structure where if you can prove you have some African blood within yourself, you are able to travel to Ghana freely without a visa to experience their culture for a day. It's already there. It's already possible. What our model is doing is enforcing that possibility within other states. Ghana is just one example. It's not even a possibility anymore. It has happened.
And
So
we need to take in consideration that this is a policy debate. It's something that would be implemented. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to both teams for this exciting segment of cross-examination. We will now pause for 1 minute to allow the fine-tuning of the reply speeches. At the end of that 1 minute pause, we will resume with the reply speaker from team opposition, followed by that from team proposition. All right, debaters, your 1 minute pause begins now. All right, your 1 minute pause has elapsed. It is now time for us to resume this debate. I now invite the third speaker on the opposition team from Team Clarendon College to conclude the opposition's case. Hear, hear.
Sir, wait. But it's not sure. I will switch.
Clarendon College,
I'm
we are
coming.
ready to hear your. Okay, very well.
Okay. As the third speaker for the opposition, my role is to bring this debate to a close by weighing the arguments and showing clearly why our side has won. At its core, this debate is not about idealism, it is about outcomes. It is about where Caribbean citizens can realistically achieve better lives, support their families, and contribute to their home economies. On all of these fronts, the opposition stands stronger. Let us begin with the most important issue in this debate: economic impact. We demonstrated that migrating to former colonial powers results in significantly stronger financial outcomes due to higher wages and stronger currencies. This directly translates into higher value remittances sent back home. These remittances are critical in, for example, as my second speaker stated, in Jamaica, they contribute approximately 19.1% of our GDP. This is not a small figure. This is the pillar of some families. Families depend on this money for education, healthcare, and daily survival. Entire communities are sustained by it. Now compare this to the propositions world. They are asking Caribbean citizens to migrate to regions with weaker currencies and lower wages. Even if migrants work just as hard, the value of what they send home is significantly reduced. This means less spending in local economies, less business activity, and ultimately less tax revenue for government. This results in slower development and weaker public services. So when we weigh on economies, our side provides maximum benefit to both migrants and their home countries. Mr. Speaker, the proposition limits Africa to just Ghana and Nigeria, but Africa is a continent with various states, and they fail to acknowledge the fact that we cannot guarantee anything in politically unstable environments that rely on things such as violence to get what they want. Secondly, let us move to stability and safety, which the proposition consistently failed to respond to. We show that many African states face serious challenges, including political instability, civil conflict, weak governance, and overstretched public services. These conditions create uncertainty for migrants. They make it difficult to find stable employment, plan long-term, or even feel safe. We gave examples of countries facing humanitarian strain, refugee pressures, and infrastructural challenges. These are not rare exceptions. They are widespread realities in many regions across Africa. What did the proposition offer in response? They relied heavily on just Nigeria and Ghana. But Mr. Speaker, these states also struggle, and they also relied on morality and a sense of belonging. Mr. Speaker, persons from post colonies are more likely to adapt in Africa because they are already assimilated with the culture. They speak their language. Europe, they speak their language. They have similar educational systems, so it is better for them, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, let us be clear. Cultural familiarity does not replace functioning institutions. It does not guarantee access to healthcare. It does not protect migrants from economic hardship or political instability. On the other hand, former colonial powers offer predictable systems, stronger legal frameworks, better healthcare, and stable governance. These are the conditions that allow migrants to succeed, build careers, and support their families. When we weigh on safety and stability, the opposition again clearly wins. Thirdly, on quality of life, life and opportunity. Our side showed that migrants to former colonial powers benefit from better education systems, more job opportunities, and higher wages. These factors are essential for upward mobility. Migration is not just about moving, it is about improving one's life. Now, Mr. Speaker, let's weigh this debate. On our side, we provide economic strength, higher remittances, stability, safety, and real opportunities for advancement. On their side, they provide moral arguments, weaker economic returns, instability, and uncertainty. Even if, Mr. Speaker, even if we accept their policy, it simply cannot outweigh the tangible real-world harms that come from weaker economies and unstable conditions. People migrate to improve their lives, not to take risks that they leave them worse off. Ultimately, this debate comes down to one simple question: where are Caribbean citizens more likely to thrive? The answer is clear: in environments with stronger economies, stable government, and better opportunities. Former colonial powers. Mr. Speaker, for all these reasons, we firmly stand in the opposition and the opposition. Close.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of that side's case, the opposition side's case. Thank you very much, third speaker from the opposition team. We now move on to conclude the debate with the presentation from the reply speaker from team proposition. Let's make that speaker welcome.
Good afternoon, all. We, the proposition, will now conclude this debate and state why the government has won. First and foremost, we again are not restricting the choices of our citizens. We are just simply highlighting a preference for African states. We are not coercing citizens. The opposition had also stated that former colonial countries have a better standard of living and that Africa suffers from yellow fever. Is that not true about Europe with its history of, for example, the Black Death and various plagues that it has had? Of course, the disease is suffered throughout many countries. It's not just relative to Africa. Furthermore, scholarships from Europe states are very, very competitive because people from all over the world wish to compete for them. In our model, we are guaranteeing scholarships, no strings attached to whoever applies. And we are also guaranteeing university exchanges, which is way better than the unguaranteed scholarships that one may or may not receive from Europe. The opposition continues to say that there is political instability in Africa and spoke about how there is a lot of tribalism there. But what is the relativity of tribalism if tribalism is the infighting between tribes? How do we concern ourselves? How do the tribes concern themselves with us if they are concerned with fighting themselves? That does not affect us. Furthermore, there is political instability in Europe. For example, the recent tensions of gang violence in France, for example. The opposition also questions where the funding of this money will come from. This will come from through the governments of the countries that are inside of these bilateral agreements. We would also, the opposition had also pointed out that Africa has little to no resources. Mr. Speaker, this is completely false. Africa has booming industries in oil, gas, copper, and coffee particularly from Ethiopia, and those are all sought after materials, not to mention gold, and there are also Afrobeats. Everybody has heard of or mentioned or heard of the impact that Afrobeats is happening internationally, just not only in Africa. The opposition had also commented on the exchange rate between Africa and Europe is low. Why is that? This is because there is significantly more people pouring over into the workforce in Europe and bumping up the value of the dollar because more people are using it in its exchange rate. If much more people started to work in and use African currencies, then African currencies would therefore become stronger. In a cross-examination question, the opposition had stated that migration to former colonial states will not solve job gaps in post-colonial countries. I must wonder if the opposition had forgotten that in our model, we still have those bilateral agreements. There is some kind of exchange. Caribbean countries are not losing people. We're not losing resources or manpower. We are trading what we currently have with African states in order to better both of us. It is not linear like the kind of relationship we would have between Caribbean states and Europe. The opposition had also stated that we are limiting the motion to Ghana and Nigeria. That is not true. We are just using those states as examples, the same way how the opposition had continued to use Liverpool. The opposition had said that Europe offers better jobs, higher wages, and is more stable. But where
did that stability come from? The opposition had rightly acknowledged that it came from the extraction of labor and resources from regions like the Caribbean and Africa through slavery. That stability is not neutral. It is historically constructed through our underdevelopment. We developed their economies, the economies of those who plundered, raped, and kidnapped and murdered us. The opposition said that we should enjoy the former colonial countries because we helped to build their economies. At the cost of what? Are we going to forget what they did? Ignore that by doing so, we are supporting them. That is extraction. If we have the power to make them stable, why not then use our power to develop countries that are tied back to our roots? The opposition had said that Europe offers opportunity. Opportunities for who? Opportunity to do what and within what limits? Because in Europe, Caribbean migrants enter systems that are already built, already stratified, and already unequal. They're going to feel labor shortages. They adapt, but we do not control those systems. How much of us will get through to jobs, hold high positions, Mr. Speaker? As our Prime Minister had stated, migration to Europe will operate through brain drain and institutional extraction. As my Deputy Prime Minister had proven, even when migrants enter these economies, they participate, but they rarely need. It is precisely because Africa is developing that it would be much easier for migration over there. We would be heard. We had an opportunity to be businesswomen and men. Going back to our models, we would also offer them housing, reduced interest in loans, and exceptions for taxes. This is the difference that the opposition could not overcome. In their world, we are fitting into a system. In ours, we are going to build that system and then enjoy our work. How are we going to integrate into a society where there continues to be the prevalence of Nepo babies, where businesses are continuing to be handed down to relatives or people who do not deserve it? In Africa, such differences are not there. They're not restored. The opposition claims that Africa, again, is politically unstable and has a corrupt government. This is an overgeneralization also on the fact that Africa is not a single political system. Instability is also not unique to Africa, and Europe is not risk-free. In the United Kingdom as well, the Windrush scandal shows that migrants can lose rights despite decades of residence and immediate benefits. Europe also experiences political instability. The opposition also claims that migration to Africa or to post-colonial power,
All right,
sorry.
Speaker, I believe you're out of time. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the debaters in this match for doing a fantastic job at marshalling your team's case. All right, so we are now going to leave to deliberate, ladies and gentlemen. When we return, we'll return with the results, announcing the final team to advance to the semi-final round in the International Reparation Debate Competition. We'll be back with you shortly. Stay tuned.
Now, I strongly withhold the stance that reparations are needed today because of the long-lasting social, economic, and psychological effects of slavery, colonialism, and systematic depression still impacting communities.
These long-term effects have created unequal access to wealth, health, education, and opportunity.
Reparations aim to address these lasting harms and promote genuine equality and justice.
My name is Shantae Lawrence.
My name is Renee Shaw.
My name is Khadija Jennings.
And we're here representing
the Montgomery High School for Girls in the 2026 International Reparations Debate.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this International Reparation Debate Competition. This International Reparation Debate Competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparation so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement.
So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There's none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Ekiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust?
The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of the people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are at the end of this fourth and final match in the quarterfinals round of the International Reparations Debate Competition. Ladies and gentlemen, we just had two very strong teams contesting the motion whether or not Caribbean people should prefer or rather go to Africa, migrating to Africa as opposed to migrating to Europe. Now, it was clear from the outset that in the estimation of the proposition team, a major disqualifier for people going to Europe is the fact that Europe has had this sordid history with the Caribbean. Europe has largely underdeveloped the region. And when Caribbean people go to Europe, it is contended by the proposition team that they're merely continuing to exist in a state of exploitation and subjugation, and that they're continuing to develop Europe and to advance the kind of neocolonialism that is harmful to the Caribbean at large, right? We get notions as well from Clarendon, from Alpha Academy, that Africa provides a vast amount of resources, capacities, options, opportunities. Africa is more conducive and accommodating to people from within the Caribbean. And then we get consistent references to Nigeria and Ghana and other places in Africa that have unique advantages according to Team Alpha, right? When we switch over and listen and assess the argumentation from Team Clarendon College, we get 3 lines of strong analysis. We get one, that people are inherently self-interested, and that Europe provides a greater economic gain for persons, and therefore Caribbean persons should choose rather to migrate to Europe. They say to us as well that the economic advantages that exist in Europe are to be tapped into by the Caribbean people, even as a response to the atrocities meted out by Europe upon the Caribbean, which have developed Europe so significantly that it's almost as though a part of the Europe's wealth and resources and capacities are legitimately the property, if you will, of peoples within the Caribbean, as much as our ancestors have contributed so significantly to Europe's development. And they contend, thirdly, that Africa is a challenging space because of ethnic strifes and there's significant poverty and underdevelopment of the continent, and therefore it would be almost certainly inimical to the interests of the Caribbean people to go there and to choose Africa over Europe. They say that it flies in the face of the fact that human beings should seek out what is in their best interest. On the question of the moral contention, we felt like Clarendon College was a lot more pragmatic, saying, well, history has gone on, Europe has done wrong, but it is the opportunity now for us to take advantage of the pragmatic benefits that are to be had from Europe. I think there's a fair amount of attempt by Alpha team proposition to contend that there are benefits in Africa as well. What we feel, though, is that those benefits seem to be limited to some geographic spaces. We don't think that those benefits exist to a proportionately equivalent extent as they exist in Europe, right? We also find that the responses to the tribalism and ethnic tensions that exist in Europe were not as thoroughly analyzed to prove that they aren't concerns. They provide us with 2 lines of responses. They say, one, that these are conflicts between existing African tribes, and therefore it won't affect the Caribbean or people within the Caribbean. We think that that is not likely to be the case, even if it is that Caribbean persons aren't seen as being an antagonistic tribe coming into Africa. Invariably, the tensions that exist are oftentimes for resources, and the Caribbean people going to Africa would be seen to be competing for resources. So it is likely that in some way or the other, the ill effects will flow towards those Caribbean immigrants moving to Africa. And then they say to us as well that those that through their mechanism that they will be providing bilateral guarantees, support or multilateral supports between Caribbean countries and African countries, providing housing and other amenities. And then they also say to us that there's going to be an exchange of people across both jurisdictions. So Caribbean people would go to African universities and vice versa. And it would be a kind of a melding and a blending of those two cultures, broadly speaking, or civilizations, if you will. One, we find that this is an interesting idea, dare I say, potentially an impactful resolution to some of the concerns raised by Clarendon College. But we don't think that Alpha goes far enough to prove that these things are likely to happen. We don't know what the incentive is that Africa would have to engage in the Caribbean in a meaningful way to establish these sorts of multilateral relationships that will inure to the benefit of this kind of overarching arrangement that Team Alpha is contending will exist. And so we think that oftentimes Alpha does a lot of, well, we will do this and this solves for that. When it is that concerns are raised by Clarendon College, we don't think that that is a deep enough and a thorough enough response. Insofar as the bilateral relationship, the cross-cultural exchanges are not going to be have not been proven because and needs to be proven to be likely insofar as the fiat which proposition has, which team Convent of Mercy has, does not extend to these particular aspects of their mechanisms. So again, it's interesting, a good attempt by Team Alpha, but I think they needed to do more to prove that these things are actually very likely. Okay, we concede with Alpha that Africa is not a desolate space entirely. There are spaces of emerging wealth and innovation existing in Africa. Again, we're not sure what specific advantage would flow to the Caribbean or to Caribbean peoples when it is that the African population is as youthful or even more youthful as exists within the Caribbean. We think that Europe, on the other hand, has different kinds of demographic, which may find Caribbean young persons, for example, moving to Europe to be of greater advantage to Europe than would be the case in Africa. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the final analysis, a fairly decent scoring match. We have the winning team ending on 284 points as compared to the second place team's 274 points. So 282 rather. So 282 points for the winning team and 274 points for the second place team. The winners of this match and the fourth and final team that will move on to the semi-final round of the International Reparations Debate Competition is, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, Team Clarendon College. Congratulations, Clarendon College, and very well tried to you, Team Alpha Academy. That's Convent of Mercy Alpha Academy. All right, at this time, we invite both teams, beginning with Clarendon, Alpha Academy, rather, to unmute their microphones and express sentiments towards each other.
Hey, Clarendon College. We really appreciate being able to debate with you guys on this motion. It was definitely an enlightening experience, and we loved how you guys came with extremely your questions were tailored to what we were saying. We thought that was really you're listening to what we were saying, and we appreciated how you're able to pinpoint what you're hearing and not just come up with arbitrary questions. But thank you for your time, and we definitely will be remembering this experience.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And it was a really well played. You guys were really good. And we also wish you good luck in your future endeavors.
Right, so very, very kind, both of these teams. Whether or not they've won or lost, they are mature enough and decent enough to be kind to each other. That is a value of this competition. Ladies and gentlemen, the best debater in this match comes to us from Clarendon College, and that speaker is the the second speaker, that's the deputy leader of the opposition. Congratulations to you, Madam Deputy Leader of the opposition, for securing the highest score in this match. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of an exciting quarterfinal round in this international reparations debate competition. We know that you have learned, we know that you found it a valuable experience, and we look forward to even more elevated contestation of ideas surrounding motions having to do with reparations for the semi-final rounds, which comes up in a few days from now. Until then, you take care, keep the dialogue going.